Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Just give me a second, I'll share my slides. So, when I start sharing, I want to so the slides are visible. Just let me know by seeing that slides.
I'm not sure, we're having some technical gremlins there.
Gary, can you hear me? And can you see the slides?
I can see them now. You were just chopping up a bit there. Hopefully we'll all be good.
Okay. All Manuscripts to meaningful engagement. If you think about how traditionally approached publications, the model was fairly linear. Publish a manuscript, disseminate it, and consider the job done. But that model doesn't really hold anymore. Today, publications are not the end point, they are the starting line. So, what matters is what we publish, but it is consumed and whether it actually that is accessible on increasingly to the at the right is one of the most used and least consistently understood in our space right now. Most already doing something that resembles omnichannel. Doing it well is a completely different story. Now, what we're seeing across the industry is a mix of challenges, too many channels without clear prioritization, duplication of content rather than thoughtful modularization, and often unclear ownership across teams. And perhaps most important, there's still a tendency to measure activity, how much content we produce, how many channels we use, rather than the actual impact. So, in many move from a problem of limited reach to a problem of execution. And that's exactly what we want to explore today. With that context, today's discussion is really about moving from complexity to clarity. We'll be exploring where pharma and medical communications actually stand today when it comes to omnichannel beyond the buzzwords. We'll also try to discuss some common pitfalls, what tends to go wrong when teams try to translate manuscripts into multiple assets, and how can we avoid making those mistakes. And joining me today are David. David is currently Global Head of Publications Biologicals Business Unit at AstraZeneca. He brings extensive experience in scientific communication and medical with a strong focus on translating complex clinical and real world into impactful, strategically aligned publications. He has been instrumental in shaping global publication strategies, policies, and advancing innovative digital first approaches that enhance the reach and value of scientific data. I'm also happy to talk about Gary, who's joining us. He's EVP and agency lead at Coronado Medical. He's a recognized leader at the intersection of medical communications, personalized engagement, and artificial intelligence. Gary has been instrumental in discussing and driving the uptake of personalized medical omnichannel, including practical implementation over the last 10 years. Furthermore, as a member of the ISMAP AI task force, he's played a key role in shaping how AI is responsibly integrated into our field, leading AI councils focused on public policy development, driving large-scale pilot rollouts, and exploring innovative use cases such as the use of LLMs in personalizing medical content. With that, I'm happy to request Gary to share some insights about the topic that we're going to talk about today. Over to you, Gary.
Thanks very much, Puya, and hi everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I think the audio is now hopefully settled down, so hopefully you can hear me clearly as well. So yes, we're looking at today to talk about engagement around and beyond the manuscript. Really, we know the manuscript is the, in some respects, it has an interesting position. It's somewhat the end of the clinical development journey for a study, but often the start of the communication journey. So it has a very important position in the middle. And it's critical that we think about how we can broaden the reach of the all-important science and data within manuscripts to the audiences that we're trying to effect change through. So I'll just reflect on a few slides and thoughts around that. So you can just click on Puya. If you can hear me, Puya, if you can click on that'd be great.
Yes,
so that's great.
I have changed the slide. Yeah.
Oh, great, thank you. So there's 4 builds on this slide, which is fine if you want to build them all through. So essentially, when we look at manuscripts and how effective they are at this present time, there's a number of what you might call problems or issues, situations with manuscripts. And the first one really is that, as we know, audiences are very time poor when it comes to the amount of information they can assimilate during their daily practice. There's an interesting piece of data there you can see that, which states that an average HCP is spending about 88 seconds when immersing into a scientific publication. That's not an awful lot of time to necessarily pull out all the key pieces of information you want them to. And in total, they're spending about just over 1.5 hours a week on actually reading scientific publications. So you can see there's already an issue with trying to get the all-important data in a manuscript to our audiences. Secondly, we can see there as well that more recent data came out that if we do use publication extenders and other digital features, that actually does extend the reach of a manuscript in terms of audiences reading the full manuscript, which is, I think, is an interesting piece of data, because it's almost suggesting that we need extended publication material to get the full manuscript read. So I think we have a challenge there with the base manuscript itself and the amount of time people are immersing. And then secondly, as you can see on the second chart there, is that HCPs are increasingly wanting short information, which is of course supported by the info above. Short form types of information always come out as preferred options when you run surveys of content preferences across different types of HCPs, whether they're primary care or specialized audiences. They all want short form, bite-sized information. And that's really at the heart, I think, of the challenge for publications, because a publication itself, of course, is not generally a short form communication. So we have to think about how do we use the base manuscript as a basis for reaching out to HCPs in the way they want to be engaged. And so the third item there is about relevancy. So not only do we need to think about the context and the length of the material, we have to think about the relevancy, and that it's actually giving the information that they're actually asking for. And that's a critical piece of information that affects personalized engagement. Relevancy to clinical practice is so important to address, because if you're not giving the HCPs, the audiences, what they're asking for, then they're unlikely to engage with that material. And we can see that not only are they asking for relevancy, the amount of relevancy that they seem to be getting from pharmaceutical companies, they've still got some way to go. You can see on the chart there that the majority of respondents say that only some of the pharma companies are giving them relevant content. So there's still a long way to go in trying to increase the amount of relevancy that we're delivering to audiences. And all this really points to having more personalized approaches in the way we work with publications and the journey that flows out from publications. Thanks, Puya. So really, when we think about moving towards personalized approaches, we need to think about how we can engage with audiences, recognizing that audiences are different. At the moment, a lot of practices treat the audiences as one homogenized group. And of course, we know that people differ. We're all consumers of information ourselves, and we all want to receive information differently. And so if we can start to think about our audiences and the types of ways they break down, and it can either be into personas or functional segments. We won't get into that too much today, but either way, if we break down the audiences into different groupings and we understand the needs of those groupings, we can be much more effective in how we address the science and the data we're trying to communicate. And so this image is really showing that to begin with. We tend to think about, particularly with publications, we tend to think about reaching out to the authors and the experts. And so they're the innovators and the implementers. They're the ones who shape clinical research. They're the ones who often are changing guidelines and working at adopting on a broader appeal the guidelines to other audience types. And so they are primarily the larger consumer of manuscripts. But we know that we need to reach much deeper across all audiences who will affect clinical change using the data coming out of manuscripts. And that's where we put there the crossing the chasm point, which is often there can be an issue in trying to communicate the science and the data into much deeper audiences who don't often consume publications to quite the same degree as experts and authors. And we have to think about the different types of audiences we're trying to reach to. So this chart is just really breaking down audiences into usual domains. This is an innovation curve, which is at the basis of many persona development approaches. But this shows that as we reach down into the other segments, and that's HCPs, for example, who are more concerned with practical implementation, thinking about how to adopt local practice guidelines, things like that, and other audience types who are much more conservative in changing to new data, which is often what we're trying to do with publications. They can be somewhat reticent to take up the narrative and the language that's given by the experts. And so when we're thinking about the narrative that goes into publications, we must reflect on the tone of voice that's important for each audience type as well. So I think it's important, the takeaway from this slide is that in moving beyond the publication, we have to think about the audiences we're trying to reach. We have to think about the language they want to be engaged with. And we have to think about the type of content that's going to make the all-important data relevant to them. And we also have to think about the way we package the data. And what I mean by that is that the bottom point there is suggesting that different segments require different proof. And that's really meaning that they want the data and the science to be put in context of their own groupings. So it's often a piece of data which is really important can be communicated along other side data points so that it makes it relevant to that particular audience type. And so social proof or the proof of use, proof of concept within the audience type alongside the core data is a really important consideration. So there's lots of things to think about when we're reaching out to different audiences in how we start to shape the content and the narrative to really appeal to that audience, and that will increase uptake of the other manuscript itself, but also the other items we use alongside the manuscript, such as publication extenders and other core scientific engagement material. And you can just click on there, Puya, thank you. So this is my slide, and if you want to just build this through, it's okay, Puya. And what we want to show on here really is that engagement starts with the manuscripts, but manuscripts tend to be, by and large, quite text-heavy documents, and we know that the audiences who read documents tend to retain about 10% of what they read. Now we want to try and increase the retention of the data from the manuscripts, and we can do that by turning the manuscripts into different formats. So we can think about visual, audio, and then give other experiential approaches to how they can engage with the data. So the more we can increase the level of interactivity, the more we're going to be able to increase the adoption of the data coming out of that base manuscript. So it's important to think about how we turn that manuscript into other formats of content. And so we have seen, of course, the rise of things like graphical abstracts, infographics, author videos, other accompanying extenders, and they all form an important role in the adoption of the data coming through in the base manuscript. And I think it's really critical as an industry that we're able to use these formats more than probably the level we're doing at the moment. And in using those publication extenders, those other engagement articles and content pieces, we can start to think about how to match those items to the different audience types. And we will, and of course, each different situation will require different audiences to be defined. That's something that can be determined in each for each therapy area and each asset that you're all working with. And really what we want to be thinking about is the engagement journey, which is on the right-hand side. And we typically think about the adoption journey in different stages. And what we're really trying to do is to help the audience engage with your data and your content at the right time, which is matched to their learning. And of course, audiences will self-select where they are on a learning journey. They'll be aware of what they know and don't know. And so if we can provide content that really suits what they want to learn about at the right time in their adoption journey, we can make that engagement much richer. And typically we want to be using, as it says there, 4 to 7 content items along the journey to move people along. And what we mean by moving along is essentially affecting behavior change. And that can mean the difference between understanding the unmet need and the barriers to treatments behind a disease area through to actually adopting the science and the data coming out of clinical studies, and ultimately acting as advocates and wanting to share that information with peers and other groups. So if we can make the journey much more impactful, we can turn that base manuscript into other content that's really going to resonate and hopefully affect the change that you're looking for in your medical plans. And so to do all that, we need a comprehensive medical omnichannel planning approach, which really helps define those all-important audiences, what they believe in, what they want to receive and hear and consume in terms of data and content, and where we put that. And if we can get these pieces right, we'll be much more effective in achieving engagement beyond the manuscript. So with that, I shall turn over to David, who's going to explore publications in a bit more detail.
Okay, thanks. So I think it's a great setup. I think Pooja set up the fact that we can't really even define omnichannel if we were asked to define it. And honestly, we're not really doing it. Maybe some folks in the commercial organization are doing some multi-channel, and there is some pilots here and there that are happening, but we're not really doing it at scale. And why are we not doing it? Well, it's hard, and there's some challenges. I think just the first challenge really you see is just the task of doing publications. You know, a company, so I'm at AstraZeneca, we do thousands of publications, you know, upwards as a company close to 10,000. So just the process of, I'd say the publication professionals, some of whom I see are on the line, are overwhelmed with just managing the process of dealing with external experts and authors and trying to curate what should be the priorities with the team, and then trying to get the data in a good form. And there's publication content coming from all over the place. So that's one of the challenges. I think what we need to do is probably continue to learn and then hire people that have expertise on this. That's maybe the solution. The second barrier, I think, is compliance. Publication itself is a high-risk endeavor. We're trying to follow good publication practices, ICMJE, and then you say, oh, on top of that, you should do digital omnichannel. Well, okay, that's quite a task, I think, for people. So I think we don't really have a model for that. And I'd also say compliance is very nervous about some of the practices that are being considered with geotagging and paid content for medical, that doesn't make everybody comfortable necessarily. And then there's also European privacy issues that are a concern. So I think all of that makes it difficult. Maybe the answer is that I think some of these experiments in the US can happen a little easier because you don't have some of those as much privacy issues. And so I've seen some of the US companies being able to be a little more aggressive with their omni-channel. The third item is time pressure. I mean, let's face it, the pressure now to publish faster and faster and faster is increasing. Some of the new FDA new guidance is even putting more pressure on that. So going from database lock to actually doing publication is requiring a lot more pressure on the publication professionals. So they're feeling it, and that really takes away time to think about things like this. And then I'd say the fourth barrier is just cost pressure. We tend to be flat in pharma, but the volumes are increasing. There's way more real world evidence being published now than 5 years ago. There's more groups that are publishing, and all this is great, but everybody thinks their things are important. So how do you prioritize what's really matters? Because everybody thinks their content is extremely important. There are some, maybe some solutions on it with AI. I think AI can be a force multiplier that can help with certain things. So, we'll continue to look at those tools to enhance the publication process. Okay, and I'll turn it back to you, Pooja.
Thank you for the insights, and I also believe that there is a lot of confusion about multi-channel, omni-channel, opti-channel. So before we get into the details of any of this, and opti-channel, if there is channel also.
And I think you were just chopping up there, Peter, so I'll just rephrase it. So I think the question was, where is pharma and medical communications right now with the adoption of multi/omni/opti-channel? I think we've all heard these variety of terms used, haven't we, really? And I'm happy to take a first pass on that and maybe pass to David. The move from multi-channel to either omni-opti or what we call it, personalized engagement, I think that's a huge step, and I think pharma is generally wrestling with that step. Pharma has been working, with medical affairs now for over the last 30 years as a function, let's say, and I think has been used to communicating in a certain way. And I think, it requires a huge process step to move from the traditional form of, taking data and communicating it through a plethora of channels through to taking a much more audience-first approach, which is what lies at the heart of omni-channel or personalized engagement. And I think companies are still navigating their way through that. Some are embracing the move, I think, extremely well. Others are still, I think, finding it extremely complicated to make that move, really. So I think generally the industry is still somewhat in the infancy in moving to personalized engagement as a whole. And I think teams are by and large finding the re-engineering quite complex. And there's lots of reasons for that. We might get into that later, but I think by and large there's still a lot of work to do. And I think at the end of the day, though, it's an essential step that needs to be made because, as I was saying in my slides there, external audiences want personalization from pharma. They're screaming out for it. They're asking for relevancy, short form content that meets their needs. And so I think it's a process that needs to continue, but we're just starting out. Any thoughts from you, David?
Yeah, I would just add, I think you summarized it well, Gary. I would just say, the first step of solving a problem is realizing you have a problem. And I think we realized that, full form manuscripts, while they're wonderful and they've been great historically, if you ask how many medical students or residents are actually reading a full form manuscript outside of being in a journal club, the numbers would be terrifyingly low. So we do need to evolve and think about that. And really it's, I think we've started to do more long-term planning and then really engaging with partners, internal, external, to see what can we do to solve that.
I think that's a great point, David. And I think it was great because I think we were all at the ISMAP meeting that just happened in Washington, and there's a lot more taught there, which was good about the use of publications within an omnichannel approach. So I think there's a recognition that omnichannel itself is a critical step to move towards, or personalized engagement. But within that, the use of publications within omnichannel is also becoming a critical component. And of course, as we know, it starts with the manuscript often. So moving forwards into those new areas, I think is, it seems that there's increasing recognition of the importance. That's great. Back to you, Priya.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. And this brings to me another question on what are the industry trends with the journals and third-party channels, and where are HCPs going for information? Would that also make a difference to how we are engaging with HCPs? David, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who are at ISMAP, you saw our keynote speaker was from Open Evidence, and obviously these platforms like Open Evidence and Doximity are increasing. Their AI tools, they are allowing for very customized responses, which is what they're looking for. And the appeal also is maybe there's a little less hallucination, and there's linkage with some of them to, not all the journals, but some of the journals. So I think that now I would expect the big tech AI companies to respond to that. They're not going to sit there flat-footed. I expect they will start responding. So it's going to be a very interesting future world where they may become curators of information. And maybe, our, AZ medical sites and such will have to evolve with that, because we're going to have to, it's easier to actually put ourselves into that environment versus trying to create our own environment, websites, microsites, which don't get downloaded or viewed, right? So I think that is actually the trend, and where that will increase, and we're going to have to adapt with that too. Gary, do you want to add anything to it?
Yeah, thank you, David. I think those are great points. And I'd say as well, and you mentioned about Open Evidence there at the ISMAP, it was really interesting to hear what they were saying. Of course, Open Evidence at the moment is US only. And as you were saying before, David, there's certain EU AI acts which are stopping the expansion. But I'm sure we'll see Open Evidence expand its availability, and it clearly is becoming a daily tool, a daily clinical tool for HCPs in the US. I think what's interesting is that with AI with Open Evidence using AI, a lot of content in journals is somewhat invisible to AI because it's behind paywalls, and I think that's going to drive towards open access. And I think not only that, it's going to drive the use of more readable formats, which I think is really interesting, because at the moment, AI really struggles to read figures and tables and to reproduce those in summarization, and a lot of the inaccuracy can happen around figures and tables. And of course, they're a key component of manuscripts. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether AI can increase its accuracy around those formats, and whether in the short term we need to almost think, because of the importance now of search through AI and access to information through Open Evidence platforms, for example, that we might need to rethink how we actually create manuscripts. For example, should they be more text-based, which sounds like an oxymoron compared to what we're saying about the need for interactivity and things like that to make content more engaging. But it might be that those engagement items come more from content pieces like publication extenders, but the base manuscripts may need to be even more simplified, so it's easier read by AI, so it's then more accessible on platforms like Open Evidence. So I think there's an interesting juxtaposition we're at the moment, really, with where AI is, and the fact that publications may need to be written in a clearer, more consistent, non-visual way to allow accessibility.
Okay. Great. And that brings to me one of the audience questions. Nathan is asking, do all of the publication extenders, whether it's audio summary, graphical abstract, infographics, author video, do they need to be submitted at the same time as the manuscript? And if so, that's a significant amount of preparation and time needed along with the manuscript development timeline itself, which is quite true. And I was also about to ask you, what simple steps can medical affairs take to move towards personalized engagement? I think we can club these two and come up with the answer. Gary, would you like to go first?
Sure, I think you certainly can submit them at the same time. As you say, it's a lot of work to do that. The lesson with extenders is that to start as early as possible. Don't wait until submission to start thinking about creating the other items. If you can create the graphical abstracts, the infographics, other items at the same time as the manuscript, there's a lot more efficient use of your time and resources whilst you're composing, the drafting of those items. It's much easier to create the other items together. That said, you don't have to submit them all at the same time, but I think clearly you want to really drive the engagement to the manuscripts. We know from the data I was showing on one of the slides that if you use publication extenders, you will increase the reading of the manuscripts, and typically it's going to be better if you can do that around the same time. But as I say, the earlier you can start, the better. Don't got any points on that to add, David?
Yeah, I would just say I think it comes down to the prioritization task of really, and that's really what a lot of our publication professionals do, which let's prioritize the critical aspects. Obviously, we don't have the time, resources, money, even with AI, to do it for every single thing. So, where do we really want to make a splash? And then how do you drive traffic back to that original source content? I think that's the first step. And that goes back to the scientific narrative, like really being clear on what we're trying to do and what's a priority. And then, it does create, I think that world's getting a little gray area too with, okay, plain language summaries, PSLPs, but with a DOI that's linking somewhere else on Kudos or on, Figshare or other places. So it's getting very complex world. And so I don't think it's easy. I think you have to really take a customized approach and see what makes sense for this study. That'd be my answer.
Right. Yeah, great point. And with that, I'm just wondering, how would AI or modular content impact? How are we creating and distributing content? And I also have an audience question where they're asking, as AI generated content enters omnichannel pipelines, what guardrails do publication teams need to put in place to assure that adapted content doesn't introduce hallucinated or distorted clinical claims, which is a very valid point, I believe. So, would you like to go first, David?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that was a big topic at ISMAP this year. I think there's a lot of concerns about using AI for these certain tools. I think the guardrails, obviously, and it was in the guideline updates, is you need to have human in the loop, right? You need to disclose when you're using it. That's very important for all the publishers. And I think also you have to really, really be careful with, some of the things we're struggling with AI is even AI is being used for reviewers, for authors, internal or external, which actually could put our data at risk. There's lots of things related to that. A lot of downsides with AIs. I think the publishers are facing that. We heard that. A lot of publishers are getting just onslaughts of content, which is maybe, basically sort of fraudulent, submissions. So they're struggling with that. So I think we're all struggling with how to use it. I think the areas where we can use it safely right now would be, we've used it for summaries. That works pretty well, plain language summary with a human in the loop. And I think we can use it well for some of the editorial aspects, reformatting, things like that. And I think most of the journals will accept that if we follow those guardrails.
Mm-hmm.
Gary, anything you'd add?
I think you make some great points. Yeah, thank you. I think you make some great points. I echo all of what you said there. Human in the loop is really, really important. Full disclosure is really important. And the recognition that the AI still does introduce errors. So it's also really critical to think about where the content's coming from that you're using, and that you know the source of the data, that it's in. It's been created in a non-synthetic way, let's say, so that you don't get errors introduced from the start, which then can be amplified through the creation process of using AI. But of course, hopefully the human interaction and check can eliminate that. But there are some certain areas to consider. There are, there's the I think what's it called predatory text, or where text can be put into a prompt which can enable other reactions to happen. So the source content you're putting into AI, whether it's via RAG, you're introducing documents into the prompt, or you're copying and pasting text into a prompt, it's really critically important to be absolutely 100% sure that you know the content you're putting into the prompt. So that's just one thing I would say, but I think all the points you mentioned there, David, are completely valid.
Right. And then I'm taking a slight digress from discussing AI. There's an interesting question that has caught my eye. Is there a geographical bias in the type of communication channel used or gained success? Are some types of channels more used or successful in the West versus East, or US versus Europe? How do manuscripts figure in this context? It's open to both of you, whoever wants to go first.
I'll let you start, Gary.
Yeah, so you just repeat the last part of the question again, or the full question, just chops a little bit for me there.
Okay. Is there a geographical bias in the type of communication channel used or gained success? Are some types of channels more used or successful in the West versus East, US versus Europe? How do manuscripts figure in this context?
Thank you. It was a geographical, yeah. Absolutely, there's variance. Audiences across the globe like to consume data in different ways. There are generalities to that. Even in Europe, in the 5 countries in Europe, there's different degrees in which digital channels have preference over each other. But it varies across each audience type, though, ultimately. And I think you have to study each audience type and really understand where they prefer to go, because it might be one thing having an assumption about which channels are really important. And of course, all the approved channels that you'll have, MSL, email, website, they're all important, but it's the relative mix and the way you use those channels together, along with other third-party channels. There's different social platforms, of course, in Europe compared to the US, where things like Sermo and Doximity are much more important. In Europe, you have other platforms, that are clearly different. So, the social channels that HCPs use, it's important to understand those, where they share information. Peer networks is also really important. But for each and every therapy area and each audience in that therapy area, you have to do the research to find out and uncover what their preferences are for content and for format of content and the channel they go. So I wouldn't want to generalize. I mean, there is a generalization, which is that audiences are different and channels are different across the globe. But you really do need to hone in, and because if you're going down the full route of personalized engagement, you want to make your approach as accurate as possible. So to do that, the audience research is going to be critical to making sure you're giving them what they want and where they want it. So I hope I've answered the question in a roundabout way. But there is some difference, but you have to explore what that difference is.
Yeah.
You did.
I'll gladly admit, I'll gladly admit I have no idea. I have no idea, and I think you do have to admit I have no idea what it looks like on different geographical areas of adoption. And I will say, open access, obviously, not having open access everywhere creates barriers more for the non-Western countries, and for countries where that budgetary wise that could be a challenge. So we certainly try to do open access as much as we can. But as far as the content, I think we're learning, and we just have to learn and be a little bit humble about the answer on that. Yeah,
absolutely. I think you're right.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Pia, but I don't think any of us really know the answer to the channel questions. I think as I said, I think you have to dig into it on each occasion. I've created quite a number of omnichannel plans, and every time I do it, the audience preferences that come out, because often it's across different therapy areas, it just varies so much. So there are generalities that come out, but it varies all the time. So I think there's no shortcut really to, and that's one of the reasons why I think adopting personalized engagement is a little bit more evolving than the traditional approaches to scientific communication, because it does need audience research. In putting the audience first, you have to fully define and understand where they're going. So sorry to echo that point, but it's not something you can just say, oh right, this is the channel that an oncologist prefers to go to. Depending, at large, they will vary on their geography. And also, if you're then comparing different audiences within oncology, they will have different preferences too. So yeah, it's important to do the research. Sorry, Pooja.
Absolutely. And I also, yeah, no, that's okay. I also think that the social fabric and the cultural practices and the preferences of a certain region would also play an important role in customizing the content for them or coming out with different channels. So yeah, it's an evolving area, and we all need to probably study the audience, the region, and then make calls as to what would work in that particular area.
I think you're raising an
All
important
right. So moving on.
Sorry, Peter, just quickly, I think you raised an important point there, that different geographies also have different, the breakdown of the audiences is different, isn't it? So, certain geographies have a much more secondary care-based approach to treatment, and the way the community specialists work with the hospital-based specialists can be very different in the US versus the UK versus Germany. So the audience breakdown, that multidisciplinary approach to managing a therapy area is very different in each geography. So it's really critical to, as you're saying, there's cultural differences as well, but just the way people work functionally in treating a condition in different markets needs to be really explored, and that will help define your audiences, and then you can start looking at it into those audiences.
Absolutely. And I would move on to another audience question, which is again completely different topic. Would extenders that are not part of the publication placed on a pharma-owned medical resource portal be considered promotional? And David, I think you're best placed to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I think it's a little different. Like there are some examples where we have, some congresses allow you to have an audio abstract. I do think these things need to be approved, though. All these extenders, I think, need to go through the approval process if it's going to a peer review format, right? So if you're going to put things out, I do think they need to be approved and reviewed. And that is part of the problem, is if we're really going to review all this content, we have a very short period of window to do that. Quite often journals, for example, will say, we'd like a tweet from you to accompany the manuscript. Well, we often don't have time to go do all that, to go back to corporate comms, get something approved. If it comes directly from one of the KE external authors, probably fine, but I think there's real risk here, and I think in a publication world we don't always feel comfortable with this, because it puts extra pressure on us to develop all this content and have it all signed off and approved in iEnvision or whatever system we're using.
Right. Gary, would you like to add anything to this?
I think David's probably covered a fair piece of it there. I think you want to get all the different extenders published before you obviously use them in other channels, and then, as David says, you want to go through approval in terms of the repurposing of the use of that content. So the channel it's going to be used through is fully approved, and it's being used in the appropriate way. If you've got that approval, then there's no reason why you can't use these items. One of the beauties of publication extended materials, it does fuel the omnichannel journey. So once you've got the base, publication approval, the distribution in different channels okayed, then yeah, absolutely do use them in different formats, and you can use them as you can use them as trigger material towards the full manuscript, or trigger material to other forms of content. That can be used in different ways to fuel the journey, but you do need the redistribution and purpose to be clarified with internal teams after publication as well.
And I would add, Pooja, that some of this wouldn't always be pub. Some of this could be MedInfo, as they put this into Aviva approval systems. So there's other approval systems beyond just publication. The source material, obviously, we need to have approved. We could get things approved otherwise through Viva, but we just need to follow our processes and policies.
Right, absolutely. So with that, I have a question again for both of you. What are best practices in digital space, and where do you see most traction, if you do see preferred channel. Also, I have an audience question. Do you have a few medical use cases that you worked on and was successful using omnichannel communication to disseminate manuscripts or Congress data? So would you like to go first, David?
Yeah, I think, there's some where I'm seeing a lot of interest and traction is on the audio abstracts and the podcasts like we did. And obviously you have some technical issues with podcasts, but there was an example on our team in a rare disease area that somebody on my team did for a rare disease, did a patient physician podcast. And, considering it was a rare disease and small population, it got, thousands of downloads. And that's impressive. I think that's a new area that instead of just doing plain language summaries, which are wonderful, and I support them, but I think also doing things like where you can have that interaction, because then you get the patient voice into it, which really adds a lot of interest and can add a lot of value.
Right. Gary, your take on that?
Yeah, I think you can use publications effectively with an on-channel approach if if you've got access through distribution rights with a journal and whatnot. So you can use the manuscripts, for example, on a medical microsite, or medical website, so that you can able to direct traffic through MSL conversation to the manuscript. But it can be part of the overall journey, whether it's a disease area point you're trying to educate on, or it's more the asset data. The manuscript can be used in different ways to really fuel that journey. And I think having a microsite is often a really good way of propagating an omnichannel journey generally, let's say, and having access to manuscripts or information, whether it's abstract or full text, depending again on distribution rights. It can be a really useful way in propagating the journey, really. So I think the more success I've seen is when microsites, medical portals, are used to full effect. So yeah, I think that's one way in which you can really drive engagement to manuscripts, and all the publication extended materials I've discussed as well can accompany it too. So yeah, that's one point I'd make. And I think did you have a first question as well, Pooja?
Sorry?
Sorry, did you have a first question before we went into the use case one? Was another question there? The part question.
Yeah, it was about the best practices. Yeah, the best practices in digital space.
Yeah, that was
So,
that.
yeah.
And
And to add to that, I have an audience, before you say something, I have another audience question which you could also add on to this while answering. Do you recommend using targeted HCP lists? And this is also included with the best practices question. So yeah, please go ahead.
I think targeted HCP lists are very useful. They may have opt-ins for receiving information, so you're able to be a little bit more proactive in your outreach based on those lists. Depends on the nature of that list. I think often you want to know the size of the universe you're trying to reach, and that can be important for analytics and metrics later. So if there's a certain population within either your CRM or your list you're looking to reach out through these activities, you can see how effective you are at covering that whole population. But certainly from an opt-in perspective, I think that can open up some doors from a general scientific communication perspective too. I'll just touch on the digital best practice. I think generally speaking, and it goes for scientific communication generally now, I think, is less is more. I see a lot of teams trying to create too much content, too much digital content. And the reality is I don't think you actually need a lot of content. It's what you do with that content that's important. So my message is less is more when it comes to digital content. Don't feel you need to create dozens and dozens of pieces of content which become difficult to engage with your audience. Try to think about connecting pieces of content together, and you don't need a lot of content to do that. So make the digital content appropriate to what the audience wants to receive, and then think about how you link it together. So think about that maybe in three ways. One is, what is the trigger content that really initiates engagement? Is it content MSL users? Is it the Congress highlights? Is it other You know, is it the journal? Think about the initiation, the trigger point, and then where do you want the audience to go from there? What are you really trying? You know, what's the key thing you want them to really take from your content? And then maybe think of a follow-on activity. What do you want them to then? Where do you want them to go next? And so, in thinking of those 3 stages, I think that can help you fine-tune how much digital content you need. But you don't need an awful lot of content. So my best practice is not to create too much, because we're seeing HCPs are being almost spammed with content from pharma. I think a stat I've seen recently is they're receiving 40 to 50 emails a day from pharma. So you can imagine when you're trying to cut through that, you really need to, you know, everything you make needs to be relevant and needs to be what they're wanting to receive. So that dictates practice to me.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, Gary, just on the publication side, it's the same beast. And the problem we have is everybody wants to publish more and more. You know, what are we up to? I think I saw numbers upwards of 3.4 million medical publications in 2025. You know, the things don't change on guideline directed therapy with just publishing more and more. So, you know, when we see that, we see post hoc analysis to death, trying to, you know, paint a Congress Hall with, you know, all kinds of posters which aren't viewed or used. Nobody looks at the QR code. Nobody stops by. So it's like really focusing on, and it's hard for us because, you know, we're the arbitrators of that discussion. And again, everybody thinks it's important. But the more we can get discipline on the scientific narrative of which are really important, and let's do 3 things really well, not 25 things. But it's hard, and that's part of our job, honestly. And I think also with the content, you know, again, it goes back to like prioritize let's do 3 omni-channel type of things that go with a publication that we can then leverage and give to other teams.
I think it's a really good point, that David. You know, I think there's a lot of journals, a lot of articles are generated, and you know, the theme of some of the theme of today's conversation is about using publication extender material. And so I'd really encourage, you know, anyone creating manuscripts to also create publication extender material if you want to increase reach and readership of the actual base manuscript. So, you know, clearly budget and resources are finite. So you know, but obviously if you want to be publishing your core data, you want to put it into manuscript format, and you'll want to think about how many manuscripts you generate in your publication plan. But sometimes there may be secondary analyses, subgroup analyses, things like that, and which you might consider, is it really important to do that? Or do I want to actually create more extender material around my pivotal manuscripts? So I just encourage, you know, and I think David said it at the start, which is about prioritization. It comes down to prioritize what you want to do, but really, you know, the use of extender material still hasn't reached its peak at all. And I really encourage the use of that material, which can then propagate the omni-channel journey that we're talking about here as well.
Right. And then with so much of discussion about extenders, I have an audience who's wondering, with the changes in how content is now consumed by the readers, do you think manuscript will cease to exist the way they are today? What changes do you anticipate? My upfront answer is no, they are still a gold standard and will remain to be gold standard. But what do you both think?
I think, you know, as we said, you know, during this discussion, open evidence and things like that are shaping the way people are accessing data. And there's going to be a lot more open peer review in the future, which will change things. You know, I think you're right, Peter. I think the base manuscript will still be there, but the format of that manuscript is going to get probably shorter. It's going to need to be more bite-sized. You know, the interesting point there about AI at the moment not being able to read tables and figures might mean the manuscript needs to be almost quite basic. It needs to be text-driven, almost like more like a plain language summary in a way, you know, like a PSLP. So that I think we're going to see abbreviation of manuscript really, and then the use of extended carrying the message of the manuscripts in a more dedicated way. But I think it's here to stay for now. You know, as David's saying, we're seeing more and more articles, more and more journals. So, you know, there's clearly seems to be a need. But yeah, I think we're going to see some format changes.
Yeah, and I would just I would add to it that I think, for your primary readouts, obviously it's still always going to be the manuscript will be king and queen. But I do think, you start questioning is the value of having a manuscript on a methodology on a very obtuse topic. Like, do we really, and that's where we're trying to have the conversation. Could we just do an abstract on this and move on? Maybe that's enough.
Yeah. And there's another very interesting take and a question about this. Do you think engagement with publications vary on a generational level? Maybe yes, kind of, but yeah. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think we've all heard the term digital native, from say 10, 15 years ago. I think it's much more now about AI native. And I think just the way people access information is slightly different across the generations, by and large. I think, there's the younger generations, we are generalizing here, but, want information to be even more concise. We've all seen the rise of things like TikTok videos and things. I think, short video format is here to stay. People want that really, quick access to information. And so I think anyone who's time pressed also wants short information. We see that in general, but the format of the delivery of that information will vary across the generations. So we see younger generations tending to prefer video-based format, whereas older generations prefer more text-based. Both can be short, but they're different formats. So I think it's more the interactive, and I think it's the rise of the smartphones and things like that. Where younger generation have grown up with smartphones almost now, and just expect everything to be instantly accessible in very short interactive format. And I think that's this. I think that leads how we develop medical content in the future, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that just analyzing the digital online leaders, that's probably is only going to grow, right? So it's seeing who's really talking about it, retweeting it, creating videos, obviously, especially on education. I think a lot of the people that do the education tend to be kind of the young up and comer, maybe not always the trialist, but some of those other folks can really help with education.
I think you're right. And I think also, social channels as well. I think younger generations place a lot more focus on social group peer channels. And I think the HCPs, who are coming through as the younger generation will also place a lot more focus on information that is shared in their peer group. I was alluding to that one of the earlier slides around social proof. I think, the role of clinical data is really important, but the context of that within a peer group is going to be increasingly discussed. And I think the way you share the opinion on data, which is kind of social impact on the data, I think is going to be increasingly important. So enabling access to peer opinion, I think is also important really, as well as the base data itself. So, and we see, we're seeing things like LinkedIn channels are becoming increasingly important as well to HCPs. So I think social and peer groups vary by generation, but are also generally increasing importance as well.
Right. And we have just 1 minute left. There are lots of audience questions. I have tried to take on as many as possible. I didn't ask my questions at all, but maybe one last question. Where is that definitive red line between a scientific awareness activity and a promotional one when using omni-channel platforms? And I have a similar question, which we can also probably take. Omni-channel communications and audience segmentation have been used to strategize commercial activities for years. Is there space for medical to work with commercial to identify areas of effectiveness and lessons learned?
Maybe I'll take the last one and you can take that first bit, Gary.
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
I would just say, whichever, but I'll take the second part first, which is, I think we can work with commercial. We have to be very careful. We do need to tap into what I call the hive, because they've done more omni-channel and content. When we talk about policies, we can do things where we can involve commercial, but we have to be very careful. We can't involve commercial in actually developing a manuscript, picking authors, picking journals. That's where the stop must happen. But we do need to engage with commercial more, because, and it was the topic actually at the ISMAP, which is you can't just ignore your commercial colleagues. In the omnichannel world, you have to tie in. So Gary, what would you add?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think, the planning of an omnichannel journey can be a joint activity in many respects, because the HCP perceives medical and marketing as both being far, so they want a consistent approach. So I think it is critical. I think in terms of the promotional journey, you know, in terms of advocacy and things like that, I think, you know, we have to be led by the HCP need and demand for medical education. You know, in terms of proactivity around that, we know if there's, you know, I think someone said about before with lists, if you've got opt-ins, ways in which you can propagate that journey through encouraging the HCP to explore additional information, again based on their need, you can be compliant in the way you're orchestrating the journey. We don't obviously have as much freedom as they do on the commercial side, but planning omni-channel journeys is still possible, and impact can be made by joining activities together in ways that are not promotional. And we've seen this, you know, done effectively many times. So you can go through the whole journey of adoption, you know, through from awareness to adoption to advocacy without it being promotional. So I definitely encourage you to think about ways in which you can do that, using the content that you've got, and using things like opt-ins, registrations on microsites and things like that to help propagate the journey as well.
Right, absolutely right. And I believe the foundation of an omnichannel would be probably a blend of commercial, medical, and even regulatory and compliance teams, and then only an effective omnichannel strategy could be planned out. I hope my network allows me to at least come on camera to thank you. So yes, thank you to both of you for taking out time, and thank you to the audience who's been very patient despite some technical glitches on my end. I hope I have answered as many questions as possible. If there is anything else you want to connect us with, please reach out to us on LinkedIn, and we'll be more than happy to answer your queries. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.